the majority of the Polish, Italian, and Jewish residents living in Humboldt Park moved out. Their departure from the area meant little city services for the Puerto Rican newcomers. Consequently, Puerto Ricans were living in deplorable housing conditions.
The Polish people started moving out, more Puerto Ricans started moving in, but as the Polish people started moving out, we were getting less and less services for the Puerto Ricans that were coming in.
But what we begin to see is not so much that we were welcomed and space was made for us, but rather what we begin to see is a lot of white flight, a lot of people who didn't feel comfortable, didn't like us, who decided to leave this West Town and Humboldt Park area.
The whole reason why we had slums and the buildings were all torn down and everything is because we didn't own those buildings. Those buildings were owned by people that lived like in Oak Lawn or they lived in Elmhurst, and they had all these buildings in Chicago.
All of these people who once lived here and invested here were now people who had moved to the suburbs, have moved elsewhere, but they continue to own the buildings and they continue to come every month and get the rent, but do nothing for those buildings. Those buildings fell apart. Puerto Ricans were living under the most miserable conditions imaginable.
And incidents of police brutality increased. Puerto Rican residents faced daily abuse from the police and shared a pervasive belief that police were physically brutal and harsh to them because they were Puerto Ricans.
Let's start talking about, community and police relations. In Puerto Rico, I would be Mervyn Mendez Rodriguez. And if I use that name in Chicago, in 1960, when a police officer asked me, "What's your name?" that police officer would interpret my response as me not cooperating and resisting. So that led to a lot of problems.
I grew up in an environment where my dad didn't trust the police, and so we didn't trust the police growing up either. And it's become, it's become a big cultural shift for me now to be working with police and working with such a diverse workforce. But that wasn't the case in those days. And I think as a young person, we were all lumped together as being gangbangers. And so when we got pulled over by the police, we were taken in all the time.
It was like, we seen the police and it was like, it was going to be the worst. I mean, bad news. Seeing the police, it was bad news because they never treated us with respect. It was not relationship at all.
It was very common for the Caucasian police officers to ask them their famous question, "Why are you hanging around with these spics?" And taken away and beaten.
Before they come in and shovel everybody in the pedal wagon, that's it, like it or not. And there was a lot of abuse. Every time they felt like they need a couple of bucks, they just stop you for hardly any, no reason. You have a tail light on your car missing. They knew for sure. They have $5 for breakfast or lunch or whatever. It was easy target.
Positive relationship at that time was not there. It was one based on fear more than anything else. And so when we experienced the beatings and the racism, we never thought of going to the police for assistance. There was never a police report filed. We just took it and we accepted it as part of life and just lived with it.
During the summer of 1966, the city of Chicago became the site of the first major Puerto Rican riot in the history of the U.S. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King brought his civil rights crusade to Chicago. Mayor Richard Day Daley and city officials were preparing for civil unrest and protesting in and around the city's south side. The storm that was brewing at Chicago's northwest side went unnoticed. On the morning of June 12, 1966, tens of thousands of people gathered on State Street to celebrate the first major Puerto Rican parade in Chicago.
For me, it was my first time at a parade like that. I felt pride, seeing the Puerto Rican flag everywhere, feeling a sense of pride because we were recognized. We were being recognized by the city. And there were people walking by who were not Puerto Ricans and looking with smiles on their faces and enjoying the festivities.
On that Saturday, I remember vividly going to the parade. We all came back into the neighborhood. I remember that I was in one of the floats and we were representing the San Juan, the capital. So we were dressed in senators, the girls that were in the float.
After the downtown parade, many families continued the celebration in Humboldt Park. By early evening, a white police officer shot a young Puerto Rican youth near the corner of Damon and Division. The situation worsened, and the police brought in attack dogs. For 3 days and 3 nights, the Puerto Rican crowd demonstrated against police brutality.
And so this was just not any corner. This was a corner of great visibility, of great importance, with a lot of traffic. And it's in that corner that you have these wailing sirens come in to support the police after the initial encounter with Mr. Cruz.
One of the police took the dog that were in the back seat with the back seat. Then he was holding the dog. Suddenly the dog got loose, and they went straight to the lady that was sitting on the stair because, like I said, it was hot. The lady was expecting a baby, and the dog bit the lady. That's when, out of nowhere, all those kids came in. They start fighting with the police. The police start hitting them.
And the police sparked it by the dogs. They found these canine dogs. And to Puerto Ricans, that kind of symbolized all their hurts, real or imagined, these dogs, and these police are actually sicking these dogs on us.
People being frustrated, they said, no, we're not leaving, we're not going. We're not gonna let this happen anymore. And people kept milling around and the group got bigger and bigger.
Now 6 o'clock in the afternoon or 7, we heard that the lights went off in the park. And the police screaming and yelling, the party, it's over.
The police treated the protest as a riot and ordered all available personnel into Division Street to stop the riot.
Your mentality, you don't care what happened to you anymore. You are so frustrated, so sick of what's going on, being mistreated, that you say, I don't care what happened to me. I'm just gonna go there and just be part of it. So until they hear us.
And people had to do something about it. So there were 3 days and 3 nights when people were in the streets, they were breaking windows, they were setting things on fire, there was garbage cans and everything else we set on fire.
First night was all the busting up and all the turning around and running from, because I remember very well, running from Division and California, just running toward Western Avenue. Hundreds of people just running, tearing stuff up.
But there were streams of blues. They would come into these wagons and they would open the door and you would see all of these streams of blue. People with their nightsticks and their helmets.
Remember my mom and my dad just saying, everybody stay down. Everybody stay down. I was young, I wasn't sure what was going on. But we looked out the window and we saw police coming out of everywhere. And police chasing people everywhere.
I remember an event where the police took a guy and said, get in your house. He said, pero yo no vivo aquí. Get in your damn house, pero yo no vivo aquí. And they pushed him inside the house. And the last sound that you hear before the door is closed is, pero yo no vivo aquí, but I don't live here.
Everybody wanted to beat up on police officers, but here were people who were falling, people who were getting bit by dogs, and nobody was doing anything about it. And somehow you needed to get the police off of them in order to grab that person and try to take care of them. Administer first aid or get them to the hospital, carry them to the hospital because they weren't going to do it. So the community had to do it.
The Division Street riot, one of many disturbances across the nation in the 1960s, drew attention to poverty and strained relations between Puerto Ricans and the Chicago Police Department. On June 15, 1966, order was finally restored on Division Street. The riot resulted in 49 arrests, 16 persons injured, and damage caused to approximately 50 buildings.
And as people rioted, as they
and we could say, well, there was violence, there were just horrible things, and it's true. But at the same time, people were experiencing a process almost of their own liberation.
So we were not ashamed of what happened. I mean, you don't feel good about it. There's no question about it. You don't like to get to that point. But then you say, well, what the hell, we have to do this for the cause.
The riots of 1966, for me, were a rebellion. They were a rebellion of a people who said, enough is enough. They were a rebellion of a people who said, si se puede, just like Mexicans and other Latinos are doing today. In other words, that we can do it. We can make things happen.
The riots really crystallized a lot of the unhappiness and a lot of the problems that were in the community, particularly not being able to participate economically and socially within the city and had any power within the city.
After the Division Street riots, the perception of Puerto Ricans as hard-working, peaceful migrants changed. News articles began to focus on the problems of gangs, drugs, and violence that, according to the media, characterized the community. A month after the riot, the Chicago Commission on Human Relations held open hearings which provided a forum for Puerto Ricans to discuss problems facing the community. Discrimination in housing and hiring practices by the police and fire department, as well as poor educational opportunities, were brought up.
They were saying things that made sense. You know, they were not saying things that were stupid or off the wall or provoking. They were not saying we have to have a lot of violence and kill everybody. They weren't saying that. They were saying we want some respect, for God's sake. We want to be respected for who we are, where we come from, where we're going with our lives. We want a good school. We want a decent school where we can go to school and be educated. We don't want the teachers to make fun of us because we happen to speak Spanish as our first language. You know, and we don't want that to happen anymore. We're sick and tired of it. You know, we really are sick and tired of it. So I mean, they had really right ideas.
The city implemented new programs like the Division Street Urban Progress Center to facilitate better relations between the city and the Puerto Rican community. Agencies like the Spanish Action Committee of Chicago and the Latin American Defense Organization also emerged from the riot to ensure that the community concerns such as education, housing, health, and employment issues would be actively addressed in city politics. The city also encouraged the police department to implement key changes. Superintendent O.W. Wilson issued a general order calling for racial integration of squad cars, Spanish classes for officers, and changed its height requirement.
It gave those leaders that came out of the storefronts, those leaders that came out of the regular houses and churches, gave them a platform to start demanding some change. Gave them a platform to start talking and organizing.
Sense of civil rights. Puerto Ricans marching, Puerto Ricans demanding that the powers that be not taken for granted anymore. The emergence of community leaders. And then later on you have second generation of leaders. ASPIDA was created, you know, this recognition that we need to get our young people college educated. It was no longer like our parents who were just laborers and uneducated. Now we have to educate the youth and we really want to make progress in the city.
And it was then the city of Chicago who had to say, hey, okay, let's start to bring in some services. Let's start bringing in some things. And they didn't do a very good job of it. But you know, for us who hadn't had anything, that little bit, that's a whole lot to us.
Organizations like SAC and NADO focused their energies on community activism. They boycotted, picketed, and held demonstrations to protest the city's failure to provide important services to the Puerto Rican community. Some Puerto Ricans fought against urban renewal projects that displaced Latinos from certain areas. In 1967, the Young Lords, a former turf gang, organized to stop sprawling gentrification. Soon, they evolved into a well-organized socio-political activist organization.
You know, we got involved in the 60s after the riots and that, and we wanted to do the same thing that the African American community was doing after the death of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Kennedy. We wanted to do something similar in the Puerto Rican community, and so when I came out of jail, I was reading some material about that, and I decided to take the gang that I had become a leader of. I wasn't the first president of the Young Lords, but I was, I guess, the last one because I became a leader, and then I helped to transform it into a political movement.
In 1969, The Young Lords took control of the Methodist Church on Armitage Avenue and renamed it the People's Church. The Young Lords then set to work and founded a daycare center, a free health clinic, a cultural center, a newspaper, and a free breakfast program for neighborhood children.
We felt that was the solution. If we can empower our community, then we can come up with our own plan, and we can tell them, this is what we want, and we're not asking or begging, this is what we want. And so that was our goal, that was our mission at the time, it still is today.
In the late 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover ordered a government crackdown on all militant organizations. Intimidation, harassment, and surveillance ran rampant and were directed towards groups and individuals who encouraged fundamental change and power. Throughout the early 1960s and 70s, the FBI targeted political organizations under the COINTELPRO flag, a counterintelligence program targeted against radical political organizations, individuals, and colleges.
It's really in Puerto Rico where the FBI in 1959 begins to really define what came to be known as the counterintelligence program, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was then used against the African Americans here, particularly the African American Liberation Movement. It was used against Martin Luther King, it was used against Malcolm X, it was used against almost the entire black leadership. It was used against the Mexicans in the Chicano movement. It was used against Corte Gonzalez, Reyes Tijerina, Cesar Chavez. It was used to divide, disrupt, and destroy those movements.
The city of Chicago also formed its own counterintelligence group known as the Red Squad, a group that consisted of Chicago police officers and former CIA and FBI operatives to target and infiltrate political organizations in Chicago.
Obviously, by the name that was assigned to it, they were anti-communist. And the way that they would go into organizations was to, or discredit leaders, was to act as community residents and start letting others within the community know that so-and-so's a commie or a comunista or a socialist or something of that sort, and start fomenting distrust in that fashion.
We started a journal. We call it the Rican. And all of a sudden, this guy shows up and he says, "I want to join you. You're a boy. You're doing something exciting. I have some metal cabinets that I can give you." And I remember, wow, because we used to meet at the office of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. We used to meet here and there. And all of a sudden, we have this Anglo guy as a member of our group, and we were innocent. And later found out he was a cop.
2 months after the riot, the Red Squad infiltrated SAC and was successful in convincing some of its members that its executive director, Juan Diaz, was a communist.
First thing they did was lying to their teeth, to dirty the people named like Mr. Diaz, the organizer, someone who was dedicating his time, day and night, working for the great cause, and they managed to dirty his name and to create confusion among our people in the community. That was terrible, that was bad.
Some people say that the Red Squads were rather amateurish, that they kind of stood out. Others didn't see them coming. And oftentimes were manipulated and used by the Red Squads. People that thought that they were helping the community inadvertently were really doing the community harm.
Despite the numerous obstacles faced, the Puerto Rican community pressed forward. One area they continued to fight for was for better education.
Bilingual education became one of the very first rallying points for our community to organize.
There was a lot of fight and a lot of struggles that the community had to engage in to change the educational system and to change the school.
The school system at that time had very few Puerto Rican teachers. In fact, it wouldn't, it wouldn't be until the late 1960s, 1970s, because there was a very aggressive bilingual education movement here in Chicago.
I think I transferred to the bilingual education program actually in 1970. It was one of the first ones that had been created here in the Chicago area. And actually the teachers that worked in our bilingual education program were actually from Puerto Rico. Primarily there was actually an effort to recruit Puerto Rican teachers to come and teach in these bilingual education programs.
In 1973, students rallied and shut down Tule High School, calling for the removal of its principal, demanding changes in the curriculum and building improvements.
Or one of the main things that they were complaining about was that the principal at that time was not sensitive to Puerto Rican students, that he didn't really care about providing or even listening to what Puerto Rican students wanted. Some of the other complaints were that there was the lack of Puerto Rican or Latino teachers at the school, and also the lack of a Puerto Rican curriculum, not even a basic, history of Puerto Rico class.
The students' demonstration led to an even larger movement that requested not only a new high school that would better facilitate the growing community, but also one that would better service the ethnic makeup of the area with a balanced curriculum. The Roberto Clemente High School, the second largest Latino high school in Chicago's public school system, located on Humboldt Park's eastern border, opened its doors in 1973.
I came from Tule, coming to Clemente, and wanting to know that the Roberto Clemente name would be the most beautiful name and the most beautiful school that was created in our area, and that I wanted to see it, in a very positive and for people to see Roberto Clemente is a very positive school to send our kids. So it was quite a challenge.
A decade after the 1966 riot, the same grievances were still being expressed. Housing pressures mounted in 1975 when a wave of arson depleted nearly 30% of the housing stock.
There was fires and arson that was going on at that time. There were practices to push people out, and so a lot of houses were burned. Mysterious fires arose in different areas of the city, and that was a way of getting rid of buildings so that they could get rid of tenants and clean the area and prepare it for new development.
There was a time when the people who owned the building would rather burn the buildings down than to rent to us. Of course, that will backfire to them in the future, because if they abandoned that area and then when it became gentrified, those properties are worth a lot.
We started seeing vacant land becoming something so rampant going on because of the fact that buildings were burning down. As a young person, I never understood what was behind that, but I also believe that a lot of us did not own our own buildings. We just lived in them. And sometimes I always felt that because of the fact they wanted to get rid of some of us, that was the way of getting rid of the building.
On June 4th, 1977, a second riot on Division Street broke out when charging police officers went into Humboldt Park during the Puerto Rican Day festivities and shot and killed 2 unarmed Puerto Ricans. Both men were shot in the back, which led to a 2-day community uprising.
You get the 77 right, it comes on board. And people just had enough.
The incident of the guys getting shot, to the point where you saw a revolution of people just in an oppressed community that just could not take it anymore and just felt that was their way of and my mom and they would say this, they would talk about how it was provoked by the police.
If you were caught on the street, you were going to jail, and they would make a case on you. And it was like that for many years after that,
The police force that they put out there in fear of, that this will happen again, which now that I'm older makes me think, but what happened then was a community responding to an abuse.
The outbreak in violence that occurred during the 1977 Division Street riot demoralized an already weary community that faced rising unemployment rates, increased poverty, inadequate health care, continued police brutality, and political marginalization.
Under hundreds of years, many people have been coming in here. The Irish and the Germans, Croatians and Lithuanians and Italians, Swedes and Spanish-speaking people.
Puerto Ricans came to a city that was also divided along racial and ethnic lines at the political level. And so Puerto Ricans had to, in many ways, learn the ropes of the political process.
At that time, there were no Puerto Ricans who were running for office. There were no Puerto Ricans who became even precinct captains. In areas where you had large numbers of Puerto Ricans, if a Puerto Rican worked, it was as an assistant to the assistant precinct captain, which is the lowest you could get.
Within the political arena, we were invisible. Even though some of us were there in small numbers, we were invisible. And it wasn't until the 80s when things just opened up, when we won the first redistricting case.
The Chicago Democratic Party, also known as the Machine, controlled the heavily populated Puerto Rican wards through well-crafted city maps. This, however, would change after the 1980 census following several well-publicized lawsuits.
The Puerto Ricans, when they began to move in, found resistance from the politicos because they did not want to be replaced, even when Puerto Ricans were the majority. So there were efforts to gerrymander, to separate so that Puerto Ricans would not have a large amount of people in a community where they elect their own representative.
Since their arrival, no Puerto Rican had held elected office until 1981, when Mayor Jane Byrne appointed Jose Martinez alderman of the 31st Ward, which encompassed West Town and Humboldt Park.
Well, Jane Byrne appointed one of the first aldermen, a guy named Jose Martinez. And the Puerto Rican community got infuriated. They got angry. It's like, you now want to pick who our elected representatives are supposed to be. Kind of plantation politics. That's not what we want. We want to elect our own representatives. We want people who represent the community.
Following the election of Mayor Harold Washington in April of 1983, several Puerto Ricans were named to high-ranking city positions.
Lots of people got hired to go work for the Harold Washington. We learned new skills. We gained new confidence, skills, and we gained new avenues to power. People, even before I got elected, people could see that my very presence at City Hall made a change and a difference. I could act because I had the ear of a powerful mayor of the city of Chicago.
After Harold Washington was elected mayor, then I started contemplating running for office. And at the time that I decided to run for the state senate, I had had no real prior political experience. I didn't have any money. I didn't have a political organization. I was just caught up in the movement for Latino political empowerment that I had helped shape at that time.
Ours was a victory against the past and the structures that didn't allow us to speak for ourselves, to allow new independent voices. And since then, I think you've seen the emergence of many new, when I got elected, people think. 1986, there was one Puerto Rican state rep. 1986, there was one Puerto Rican alderman. That's it. Today, 20 years later, God, there are 3 or 4 state reps. There's 2 state senators. There's a congressman. There's a county commissioner. There are like 4 aldermen. I can't remember all the elected officials. And then when you take, in terms of the structures of city government, there are people in all the hierarchy of that city government that are Puerto Rican that came from this neighborhood.